Hello. Nice to meet you. It's my first time talking abroad, so I'm a bit nervous. Please bear with me. Thank you. So my name is Tiffen. Which is the French for Tiffany. I'm an Android developer living in Japan, and I work for DNA, where I'm in charge of a live streaming application called Pococha. And I also volunteer for the Japanese Android conference, Dorit Kaigi. And the fastest way to get my attention is to talk about accessibility or privacy. I will love you forever. But enough about me. So let's get started. Here is the agenda. First, we'll make sure that we all start on the same base by brushing up your knowledge regarding focus in Android. And then we go over a checklist of the usual problems related to focus and how to fix them with XML. And finally, we'll talk about focus in the compose world and how to handle the checklist problems. So what do I mean by focus, and what is there to know about it? So nowadays, when you say Android application, people will probably imagine a smartphone with a touch screen, and they probably expect to interact with it by tapping elements on the screen. But your Android application is actually available, as you know, on many other types of devices, like tablets, computers, TVs, and even smartwatches. And different devices will put the users in different situations where they might have different needs. And that's the reason why Android provides alternative ways to interact with your applications. And one of them is the focus navigation, which is going to be the main topic of this talk. So did you know that the very first Android phone had a physical keyboard? And some of you probably even remember the Blackberries. And that was before the touchscreens took over the whole surface of the phone and became the main way of interactions. So focus-based navigation dates from that area, and it's the way to step through the UI, navigating between the elements that are displayed on the screen by selecting one element at a time. So we need to keep track which element is currently being selected, and that's where enters the focus, which, as its name kind of gives away, represents the current position in the element hierarchy. So the element currently being focused is the only one you can interact with at this particular point of time. So with a touch screen, you're free to interact with whatever you want on the screen. But here, if you want to tap another button, you have to navigate there, or in other words, to move the focus there. And of course, elements will have some kind of visual changes to let you know that they are currently being focused. So most of the handling and necessary behaviors are already taken care of by the Android system. But as always, we developers need to make sure that things are actually working as expected. And in order to do that, Android developers need to know that there are actually two different types of focuses. So you have the accessibility focus and the navigation focus. And you might see the navigation focus sometimes being called keyboard navigation, which can be very confusing because actually both of those focuses are focus navigation. They are variations of the same thing because they both use a focus to move through the UI one element at a time. So why do we bother having two focuses then? That's because the target is fundamentally different. So while the navigation focus is for when the user doesn't touch the screen, the accessibility focus is for when the user doesn't see the screen. So if you swap this around, that means that when you're using the navigation focus, you can actually see the screen. So you don't need as many information as you would need with accessibility focus, because you can already read the text, see the images, or understand the layout. So you only care about being able to do the usual actions, like tapping buttons. So in coding, that means you won't look at the same attributes. Since you don't need, for example, to know more information about the images, you won't need the important for accessibility or content description. And one more difference is that the users don't rely on the same tool. So while the accessibility focus will use screen readers like TalkBack that will announce all the elements displayed on the screen, with the navigation focus, you will use keyboards, for example. And keyboards are usually associated with hardware keyboards, like the one used on tablets and Chromebooks. But maybe because of that, developers might think that if most of their users are using a smartphone, they don't need to care about it then. But actually, on-screen keyboard also use navigation focus. So for example, when you want to tap some text in a text field, you will tap the view, and actually you're requesting to display the navigation focus. So you're switching from touch mode to navigation focus mode. And that's why the text field will change of appearance. And when you're done typing that text and that you tap the Enter key, you might expect the focus to go to the next text field, and that's also a navigation focus experience. And apart from keyboards, navigation focus is also used with many other types of devices. So you have the TV remote for Android TV, the rotating bezel on smartwatches, and also game controllers, since you can use them on your smartphone when you're playing games. And please note that navigation focus is technically also an accessibility focus because it's used by some assistive technologies like switch access. And finally, the main difference between those two is also the focus indicator. So while accessibility focus only has that default outline rectangle, like the green one, the navigation focus will vary in shapes and colors depending on what it is currently being focused on. So usually the indicator will look like this for the navigation focus. So the background of the color, the background color of the element currently being focused will be slightly lighter as to highlight it. And as a comparison, on the right you have the TalkBack indicator, which will be like this, whatever element it is currently being selecting. Okay, now that we understood the difference, I want to make it clear that today, due to the time restriction, I will only talk about navigation focus. Sorry. Or as I might dare to say, we'll focus on navigation focus. I had to say it. Okay, one more point before we're done with the basics. There are actually two types of navigations that will rely on the focus we're going to talk about today. And the first one, probably the one that most people are familiar with, is the directional navigation. And that's the one you use with the D-pad, the directional pad of your TV controller, or what we saw with the older phones. And it's also called a two-dimensional navigation because the focus mainly goes up, down, left, or right. And I'm saying mainly here because there's a little caveat. Depending on the situation, the focus might in fact jump to much further places. For example, when you're using the back button or the middle button on the controller, the focus will jump to some other elements that's not right next to the one currently being selected. And the other type of navigation is the tab navigation. It's the one used with switch access or when you navigate with the tab key on a keyboard. And it's also called one-dimensional navigation because you can only go forward or backward in a predefined order of elements. And that predefined order is the one in which elements appear in the layout. And from what I've seen, it's usually from the top left to bottom right, like kind of similar to TalkBack, but it's probably depending on your phone language setting. So to sum up, we have the navigation focus and accessibility focus that are variants of the focus navigation. And when you want to handle navigation focus, you need to take care of both the directional one and the tab one. And apparently, accessibility focus would be some kind of tab navigation, but I'm not sure about that one, so please come talk to me if you know better. Okay, now we have a solid understanding of what the deal is with focus. So let's review together the main problems that you need to be aware of in order to improve the user's experience. So as a developer, here are the 4 rules that you need to keep in mind. When using the navigation focus, a user should always be able to do all the actions available in touch mode. Navigate the UI without getting stuck anywhere. Be able to distinguish where the focus is at any time. And finally, skip any element that is not interactive. And of course, there are other points that you want to look at if you want to provide a delightful experience. But let's say this is the basic minimum you want to clear. So we want to make sure that the user can actually move through our app. So to make sure that all interactive elements can receive the focus, you need to add the focusable attribute. Because if you don't, then the user will not be able to select that element and perform the action. So if you're using the usual Android components like button or edit text, you don't need to do anything. But if you made a custom view or if you made a usually non-focusable view clickable, like a text view or a layout, then you might need to handle that. And I'm saying you might need to handle that because if you use the normal set on-click listener, in most cases you should be fine. But the problem is with the other event listeners. So for example, this one. I'm setting a long click listener. And by looking at the namesets, it includes a click listener. You might think it's safe. But with this code, the user can't even reach the view. So make sure that you put the isFocusable attribute on that view if you're not using the usual set on click listener. And another tricky situation with the click listener is when the clickable parts are within a text. For example, links or tags within a message or an article, or even worse, the terms and conditions on a landing screen. So the problem is that sometimes when you're testing, one of the clickable spans will get the focus. So you might think it's all right, but the next one might actually not be reachable. So please double check that more than 2 are actually reachable. And on the contrary, don't let non-interactive elements get the focus. So for example, a non-clickable image view is skipped by default and should stay that way. But if for some reason they got the focus, so, well, please set the focusable attribute to false. The reason is, of course, because the navigating with a keyboard can be quite frustrating since you need more steps to reach the element you're interested in. But also because if the element receives the focus, the user will expect to be able to interact with the element. And if they can't, they will think it's a bug, and they will be unhappy, and you don't want that. Anyway, so also don't open dialogues or navigate to another screen just because they move the focus. Those kind of sudden context changes can be very confusing, so please wait for actual actions from the user. And since we want the user to navigate freely, make sure that they can move away the focus at any time. So for example, if you're writing in an edit text, sometimes you might not be able to get out of it. So make sure that the return key does its usual actions. The user should be able to close dialogues or dismiss the keyboard or go back to the previous screen with it at any time. And if part of your apps relies on web views, you definitely want to check if they're working as expected. And I'm trusting that your websites are all up to date with the accessibility recommendations, but you still need to check how it does inside the web view of your app. And you want to double check the scrolls and the drop-down list because they're known to trap the keyboard sometimes. So the Android system will decide the order in which the elements get the focus. But sometimes the focus might not make sense and you might have to intervene. For example, if you use the relative layout or constraint layout, the default logic will not work. And in such case, you can use the next focus forward for the tab navigation or the next focus right, up, down, or left with the directional navigation. And you just need to pass the view ID of the next element that you want to get the focus. Another thing that you might want to consider in order to facilitate the navigation is grouping elements. So if you organize your UI in clusters, the user can then use shortcuts to navigate from one group to another. It's kind of similar to headers with TalkBacks. So consider an application like this. You have the top tabs and the bottom navigation bar here. And what you could do in that case is to divide the UI in 3 groups, so 1, 2, 3. So the user can go to the bottom tabs without having to scroll through the whole screen. And in code, you just need to set the keyboard navigation cluster attribute to true on the parent group. But just please keep in mind that only the top one will be considered. You cannot nest those clusters. I see some people taking pictures. You okay? Okay. So also, this might be the most common issue. I'm sure you've already encountered it in the wild. I'm talking about that one bug where the on-screen keyboard appears on the text view you're supposed to type into. So the way to solve this usually involves adding the Windows Soft Input Mode attribute to the accessibility to the activity in the manifest, or maybe using the on-global layout listener. But the details will probably depend on how you implemented that screen, so I can't show a fit-for-all solutions, but I trust you can find something, because it's very, very common bug. And sometimes you can also help the user to skip some steps by requesting the focus on a text field that should very obviously be the start of the UX. And you can do that by setting this attribute, focus by default. And note that this attribute will not display the on-screen keyboard. If you want, you can request that separately, but please don't overdo it. It can be quite frustrating when you have the keyboard to pop up all of a sudden on the screen, especially when you're not done reading what's on the screen. So what would be a good situation then to use this one? So here is a very simple email application. And since the sender address is already set by default, most users would want to start by typing the receiver email address. But because the sender field is at the top, normally it would get the focus first. So here, we want to start here, so we put the focus by default attribute to the second field, and here would be the result. So the focus would go straight to the receiver email address when we are opening the screen. And it only works with tab navigation, focus navigation. So the user should always know which element they are currently being interacting with. So make sure that the focus is always visible. If you are stacking elements on top of each other, like a sticky header or maybe the bottom bar navigation, you need to make sure that the focus indicator is not hidden behind that. And also, the default focus indicator can be hard to distinguish on some background colors, so you might have to customize it in some cases. And to give you an idea of what I mean, here is how the Play Store was doing that until very recently. So you can see the usual gray highlight when the focus was on the top bar, and then it became green on the other elements to make it much easier to spot on that busy screen. So let's see how to do that. First, if your application has a background that clashes with the default focus color, you want to modify the color everywhere in your application. And you can do that by modifying the color control highlight attribute of your application theme. And don't worry, the focus color will not be displayed when you're using the touch mode. It's only for navigation focus. The other option, and probably the one you will most likely use, is when you want to modify the indicator for one specific view. And you can do that in 3 steps. So first, you want to provide that new indicator shape and color. It can be whatever you prefer. For example, I'm going with a quite ugly but very visible dark outline. And the step 2 is to define a selector of states. And there are quite a few of them available, but this time we're looking to modify the state-focused attribute. And as you know, with a selector, you need to put the most specific item at the top of the list, meaning that the bottom one will be the default view, default state. So when it's not focused. So you want to make sure that this one is always transparent, because it's the one that's going to be displayed in touch mode. And the final step is to set your brand new selector as the foreground, not the background, foreground of the view that you want to improve. And if you already had defined a click ripple there, you can just put it inside the selector as a state pressed item. And here is the result. As you can see, the focus indicator is much more visible, although ugly, on that one specific element. Once again, don't judge me about my design choices. Okay, if your carousel doesn't stop when one of its elements is being focused, it will call the focus to disappear when the element goes out of the screen. And that will be very frustrating because the focus will then reset back to the beginning of the screen. So please stop moving items around before the user is done deciding what they want to do. And since it takes a few more steps to reach an element, your user will need a bit more time. So thankfully, they can actually set up a custom time to take action in the accessibility settings of their phones. And in fact, like Android components, like Snackbar, they already take account of that setting. But if you have a custom view that disappears after some time, then you will need to implement the logic by yourself. And you can do that by accessing that value through the Accessibility Manager service. And of course, don't name your variables like that. I'm just trying to make it fit on the screen. And the Accessibility Manager has a method called the getRecommendedTimeoutMinute method, to which you pass the original timeout value that you plan to set as an integer, and one or a combination of flags describing what's on your view. And depending on those flags, the method will calculate how long it takes to process the information that are displayed and give more or less time to the user. And this will return an integer value that you can use to set your timeout. So now a tricky question. How about gesture-based actions? For example, here is an on-touch listener, and I already set the focusable attribute, so it should work, right? Well, of course, no, it won't work. And so we even get a warning from the Android Studio about some clickable view accessibility that mentions to add the perform click method in order to have the click detected. And it kind of sounds like a focus thing, so let's try that. So here we go. How about now? Well, the view is focusable indeed, but sadly nothing will happen if you try to do it. So why is that? Well, that's because perform click, as its name kind of says, will actually just execute the code that has been set in an eventual separate on-click listener. So you actually need to define that logic in order for this perform click to make sense. And the warning from Android Studio does talk about clickable view accessibility, but it's actually for the accessibility focus instead, because the perform click method will send some events to the accessibility services but navigation focus will get nothing. And in fact, navigation focus can't even trigger this method. And I mean, it's kind of logical when you look at the name of the method, okay. But then what should we do if we have an action that only can be done with gestures? In this case, we want to have a separate way to detect that the user is trying to perform an action associated with this view. And that can be done by listening to key events instead of touch events. And the onKey listener method is what you're looking for. So this listener will return the keyboard key events, so that anytime the user presses a key, it fires the associated key code. And from there, you can just choose which one you're interested in. And the list is pretty long, so I'm not putting everything here. But feel free to have a look at the documentation to know which one you want to cover. And don't forget to return true once you're done managing whatever you wanted to do. Also, you need to remember that onKey listener will fire events each time and as long as a key is pressed. So that means that if the user pressed the key even for a very short amount of time, it will still count as several events. So don't forget to parse for duplicates. And you can do that by checking for the action up key event before handling the key code. It's same as the motion event action up when you're using the onTouch listener. And by the way, if you're dealing with a custom view, you can just go ahead and override the onKeyUp method instead. And in this case, you won't need to add the parsing logic, and you can straight up handle the key codes like this. And just notice here that I'm returning the perform click method because I'm a good citizen. I'm handling that method for the onTouch listener for the accessibility focus. Okay, now for my final recommendation. Apparently, different manufacturers might give different results, so you might want to check different options, whatever you're trying to do. We're in Android, you know. So we know what to look for now and how to solve those issues with XML. Yay. But that's nice, but we're in 2024, and I'm pretty sure half of the room here is not touched XML for a while, actually. So let's talk about Compose. How does it work there, and how can we solve our problems? And from this point, I'm just going to assume that everyone is familiar with Compose, and I will just cover a couple specificities related to focus. So in Compose, when you're using the directional navigation, it's going to be the same as XML. But if you use the tab navigation, then the focus flow will depend on the declaration order of the composables. And the priority will be given to the composables that are within the same group, which is called a level in Compose. So for example, here, you have two rows that are at the same level because they share the same parent column. And going further, I populate the rows with some custom buttons. And when you try this with tab navigation, the focus will look at the composable within one row before going to the next one. So if we were to put those buttons inside a column instead, the focus will then first finish looking at the composable within the same parent. So you're going to first finish the first column before going to the second one. Just remember that. And another specificity of Compose, the modifiers, they will have a big influence on how the focus is managed. And in fact, we mainly control the focus by using modifiers. And if you find that things are not working as expected, chances are very high that the modifiers are not in the correct order. So you want to check that first. OK, finally reaching the part we are most interested in, handling the focus problem with Compose. And just keep in mind that all the code I'm going to show are what's available like right now in 2024. And since Compose is always in development, whatever I say might be wrong in a few months. I'm sorry for that. Yeah. So we want to enable the user to move through our app again. And just like with XML, if you use the default components like buttons, you're fine. You don't need to do much. But if for reasons you need to make a composable focusable, you can do that with the focusable modifier. Easy to understand, I guess. Or at least it looks like it, because actually this is not enough. The reason is that if you use this, the composable will be focusable, but it will not be visibly focusable for the user. In Compose, you have to provide the focus indicator yourself and to handle the displaying logic. Yeah. So let's see an example of how to do that. So we're going to give a composable a black outline when it's being focused, just like we did earlier. So first, we need to remember the current indicator color, and we set the default as transparent, like we did before. And then here is the composable modifier. Just imagine there is a composable somewhere in this. And we already set the focusable modifier to the composable. And like I said earlier, modifier order matters. So be careful to always set this focusable attribute as the last one, or things will not work, I'm telling you. And now we want to know when our composable is being focused. And you can do that inside the onFocusChange modifier, which will return a focus state that indicates if the element is being focused or not. And when it is, we update the indicator color to black or put it back to transparent when it loses the focus. And finally, we can put the indicator color to a border modifier. And we're good to go. Your composable is now visibly focusable. That's a lot of work, I know. But it doesn't make much sense if you can't do anything with that composable. Because remember, we only want the actionable elements to get the focus. So you need to listen for actions. And you can do that, as you know, with a clickable modifier. And similar to when you set the set on click listener that we saw earlier, here if you use this, you don't need to add the focusable modifier. It's going to be handled for you. But how about other actions, like on click listener, long click listener? So with XML, remember, we just needed to add the focusable attribute, and it would work out of the box. Well, here in Compose, the official method to detect the long clicks is the combine clickable modifier, although it's still experimental, but anyway. It has a few parameters, including a mandatory on-click and the parameter that we want, the on-long click. And it looks fine from the outside. But actually, this doesn't work for navigation focus, I'm sorry. The non-nullable on-click will actually steal the event. So you cannot trick the on-long click with a keyboard. So what should we do then? Well, we're back to the same solution as earlier. We are going to listen to the key events instead of whatever we wanted to do. And there are two methods for that. You have the onPreview key event and the onKey event. And the difference is that the first one, the parent callback, will be called first. So the event is dispatched from the top to the bottom. And the second one, the children callbacks gets invoked first. So it's the usual from bottom to top flow that we get usually with click listeners. But since for our example, we're going to go over with a very simple composable, we'll just use the onKey event. It doesn't matter. So contrary to the set onClick listener that we saw earlier, that was returning 3 values, the compose one will only return 1 value that wraps everything. So it will wrap the key event, the one that you need to listen to actually handle something. And it's called key code here. And the list of options is actually quite different than the one you use with XML, so you need to check that before using the method. Well, or at least I recommend that. And once again, don't forget to return true after you do whatever you wanted to do. And here too, don't forget also to parse the duplicates before handling the keys. And you used the key up key event type, just like we saw earlier, actually. And now you can finally handle whatever you wanted. OK, and we still want to give enough time for actions. So we actually still want to get the user's preferred timeout value. And you can still do that. You can also access the local accessibility manager in Compose. Much easier, actually. Which method has actually slightly changed of name. This time it's called calculate recommended timeout values, which is actually more accurate when you think about it. And again, you need to pass the timeout value that you originally planned to set, but this time you need to pass it as a long value. And the second parameter, remember it was some flags. This time they became booleans. So it may be easier to understand this way, actually. And all of this will return a final long value, not an integer like before. Just be careful about that one. And we still want to ensure as little stress as possible for the users. So in order to skip elements, you need to use the focus properties modifier. No, there is no non-focusable modifier. You have to use this instead. And inside this focus properties modifier, you have a canFocus attribute like this that you just need to set to false. And this will make the composable ignored by the navigation focus, but still clickable. And by the way, focus properties modifier also handles the control of the focus flow. So let's go look at that next. So let's say I want to modify the flow of the tab navigation focus. Remember, it's the one directional navigation. For that one, we can set the next or previous attributes of the focus properties modifier to point to the composable that we want the focus to go to next. But how do you reference that composable in Compose? That's where enters the focus requester. And since we don't have view IDs here, we can create references of the composable by using that focus requester. It's just like when you create references when using constraint layout in Compose. And here are the two composables that we want to keep track of. Yes, this is composable. You need to set the focus requester modifiers on each of them so that you can pass the references that we just created above. And finally, you can use the focus properties modifier to give the new direction. So from the first composable, when the user tries to navigate to the next element, we point to our second composable. And you're done. But one thing, though. When using the focus properties modifier, please remember that the top one will wrap all the others below that. So if you put a second focus properties like this one, only the first one will be used. And these rules also apply to composable with children, so you need to take care of that, or you can use that to override them if you want. And by the way, for the directional navigation, it's the same. You just use different attributes to handle the 4 directions. OK, so we just set a new default direction to the focus flow. But how about when we want to move the focus by ourselves? For example, in response to some kind of inputs. There are 2 ways to do that. The first one, if you're OK to just go to the nearest composable, you can use the local focus manager, which has a move focus method to which you can pass a focus direction. So let's see what it looks like in action. So here we have a text field. We assign the next action to the enter button so that you can actually listen to the next action in the keyboard actions. And then when the enter button is pressed, it will now call the focus manager move method so that we can tell the focus to go down, so that hopefully there is a text field over there where the focus can go. And if you want more flexibility, you can also use the request focus method. And with this one, you can go wherever you want, as long as you have a reference to the target composable, which must be focusable, of course. And this is the method you would want to use, for example, to request the focus when you display a screen. And we'll go with a very simple situation for this time. Here you have a button and a text field inside a column. Just imagine there is a column. And I want the focus to move to the text field when I click on the button. And we first need to create a way to keep track of the composable we want the focus to go to. So once again, we're going to use the focus requester. And we pass the reference to the target text field through the focus requester modifier. It's just like we did a few minutes ago. And finally, we can launch the action by calling the request focus, and that's it. But just make sure you don't call this request focus outside of a composable context, because your app will crash if you do that. It will recompose each time. That's horrible. Don't do that. I did it. Anyway, OK, that was a lot to implement. And as a conclusion, let's go over of how you can actually try everything that you just implemented so that you can make sure your app stays usable in the future. If you have a hardware keyboard, and by that I mean something that is separated from your laptop keyboard, you can just go ahead and plug it to your phone. The Android system will automatically detect that you have plugged in an external device, and as soon as you touch any key, the navigation focus indicator will be displayed, and you're just good to go. And you can also do that with anything that has a D-pad, so I use my PS4 controller. But when developing, you probably prefer to use your laptop keyboard, I'm guessing. And you can do that. You actually have 2 options with Android Studio. You can either use the emulator, or you can use a real device through the device mirroring options. So let's go over how to set up that. So for the emulator option, if you're using the profiles that are actually already included when you download Android Studio, you don't need to do anything. The directional navigation will be available by default. But if you want to create a custom profile, then you want to make sure that the option for the keyboard navigation is enabled. So here is the screen when you select a new, create new device in Device Manager tab. So if you choose any device on this list, it will be enabled automatically. You don't need to do anything. But if you choose here, new hardware profile, when you're configuring it, you will have to look at the input section and select the bottom one, navigation style. And there is this drop-down list that will be displayed with some options, and we want the D-pad one. So select that option, and once you're done with all the other configurations, you can run your brand new emulator. And this little option at the top will be displayed. So you have to click on it to activate it. And now you can start using the arrow keys of your laptop to navigate your emulator, just like you would with a normal keyboard. And the other option, as I said, is to use the device mirroring. So if you're not familiar with it, it's a tool that allows you to use your real device through Android Studio. It's going to be displayed like an emulator, but inside the Android Studio. And here it would enable us to send keyboard commands to a real device like we just did. So you just have to activate it in the tools tabs of preferences. As of Iguana version, it's in the device mirroring section in the tools preferences, where you have 3 starting options for when you want to launch the device mirroring. And you can choose whatever you prefer. And that's it. That's going to be displayed like this, like an emulator with the little keyboard icon at the top to enable the navigation focus. And now you can easily use your computer keyboard to quickly test your application while coding. Much easier, much faster. And we're kind of done. So here are the main references that I used when making this presentation. Apart from the official Compose documentation, I also highly recommend this accessibility course by Renato Iwashima on LinkedIn Learning. It's a bit old, but it covers everything you need to know about accessibility. I think it's still in Java, by the way. But still, please look at it. Okay, I hope this talk will help you, and thank you for listening, and good luck.